So, as of November 1961, Marvel has a superhero group, and within a few months it becomes evident when the sales reports start coming in that it is a success. Now, it's an all new group of superheroes, except one of them, while he may be all new, is really just a different version of one of the very first Marvel superheroes from Marvel Comics number 1 in 1939, the Human Torch. Now, that Golden Age Human Torch was an android, and this one is, something completely different, a teenager bombarded by radiation, but the powers are exactly the same. And not long after the debut of the Fantastic Four, another of Marvel's original superheroes is brought back actually in his original form. Prince Namor, the Submariner, who it turns out has had amnesia and has been living as a homeless person for years and years and years. But when he gets dunked in the ocean, his memories come back to him, and he discovers that his undersea kingdom of Atlantis has been damaged by nuclear testing, and he's really ticked off. So he becomes, as he was back in 1939 and 40, an anti-hero rather than a hero. So not really completely a villain, but the antagonist of the story the first several times that he shows up. Well, we got new superheroes. We're bringing back some of the old superheroes. Things are ticking along, and before long, it becomes obvious, just like it became obvious to DC in 1956 with the success of The Flash, we need some more. Well, a few months, actually just 2 months, just 2 months after the debut of the Fantastic Four, over in Tales to Astonish. Now remember, this is one of those titles that Marvel had been able to hold on to. They were only allowed to publish 8 books a month, right? Because DC was doing their distribution. So they had some of their science fiction / horror titles from the 50s still going, like Tales to Astonish, Tales of Suspense, Journey into Mystery, and things like that. And they had tended to be sort of science fiction oriented, right? Well, this is just another one of those stories, or so it seems. Written, plotted, co-written by Stan Lee and his brother Larry Lieber, who's also an artist, and drawn by Jack Kirby. It was called The Man in the Anthill, and it introduced a scientist named Dr. Henry Pym, who invents this ability to shrink down smaller than an ant, which immediately becomes evident is not that great an idea, because then, you're kind of easy pickings for the ants. However, later on, he develops this cybernetic helmet that allows him to communicate with the ants, and he becomes Ant-Man, a superhero. So he becomes the superhero Ant-Man in issue 35 later that year. Then, in issue 44, he gets a junior partner, a sidekick, as it were, the Wasp, Janet Van Dyne, a beautiful young heiress who is sort of a bit of a fashion celebrity and a debutante, but also a very capable and loyal girlfriend to Henry Pym, and eventually they get married, and she becomes his wife. Well, in Tales to Astonish, in November of 1963, Ant-Man, Henry Pym, makes some changes. He's figured out that if he can adjust his size and shrink down teeny tiny, he can also get, really great, big, and huge. And he's got kind of an inferiority complex about being the teeny tiny guy. So instead of doing that, he becomes Giant Man and shrinks in reverse, right? And grows and is really big. And so he does that for 2.5 years. Then he gets a different costume, changes his name from Giant Man to Goliath. All right, so he's having some identity issues here, clearly. And the fact that he did have kind of an inferiority complex about being the teeny tiny superhero, that's played up on in a skit on Saturday Night Live about 10 years after he becomes Goliath in 1978. Now, in this episode, the host was Margot Kidder, who was playing Lois Lane in Superman the movie that had just come out. So one of the skits, Superman and Lois Lane are giving a party for their superhero friends, and Dan Aykroyd on the left is the Flash, and John Belushi on the right is the Hulk. And Garrett Morris, an SNL cast member, one of the original cast like Aykroyd and Belushi, Garrett Morris is Ant-Man. Now this is significant because it's the first time Ant-Man ever appeared on screen. And the first time and, well, the only time for decades thereafter. I don't know if you've seen the Ant-Man movie in 2015, but if you did, there's this one scene where he falls full size on top of a car. It's a cab, actually, and then the camera zooms in on the cab driver for a second as though he were important, and then moves on. And a lot of people were confused about what that's all about. Well, that's Garrett Morris, right? This is an Easter egg. This is the very first television Ant-Man. All right. Well, December 1968, issue 59 of the Avengers. You've got some weird stuff going on. For one thing, Henry Pym has invented a robot that he calls Ultron that winds up not being the best idea in the world because it has some serious issues. It believes that Henry Pym is its father, and it hates its father, and so it decides to kill him. And it has this agent working for it, a bad guy who calls himself Yellow Jacket, who can shrink down teeny tiny. Now, this cover's misleading. It looks like they've got the body of Hank Pym sprawled out there, but they don't actually have a body. The claim is Ultron vaporized Henry Pym. And this is Henry Pym and Janet Van Dyne are engaged at this point. Anyway, turns out Ultron has serious issues because Henry Pym had imprinted his own personality on it, and he has serious issues. And he had kind of a breakdown and developed like a multiple personality. And so this Yellow Jacket guy was actually him, but he didn't know it until, eventually he gets his mind back and they defeat Ultron, and then he and the Wasp get married shortly after this. And they have, they live happily ever after as superheroes in superhero bliss for about 15 years. Eventually, in the mid-'80s, there's this storyline in Avengers where, still having these issues with his psychological problems and his feelings of inferiority, Yellow Jacket, that's Henry Pym, alias Ant-Man, alias Giant Man, alias Goliath, alias Yellow Jacket, has kind of a mental breakdown again, starts beating his wife. That's the picture that we showed earlier on, that domestic abuse that was going on. Starts beating his wife and starts inventing emergencies that he can come in and solve and look heroic. And he gets found out and he gets kicked out of the Avengers, and then he gets framed for a crime he didn't commit, but nobody believes him, right? Because he's become such a jerk. And so he winds up in prison with his arch enemy, Egghead, and eventually is able to get a handle on himself and redeem himself by defeating the bad guy and proving that he was innocent of the crime. And then after that, Henry Pym, alias Ant-Man, alias Giant Man, alias Goliath, alias Yellow Jacket, started going by Henry Pym. And that's what he went by for a long time thereafter. So that's kind of confusing, isn't it? The fact that he went through all those different identities, well, let's make it a little more confusing. So when Henry Pym, alias Ant-Man, alias Giant Man, alias Goliath, became Yellow Jacket, then Hawkeye, who also had a bit of an inferiority complex because all he did was shoot arrows, and he felt sort of, like weak in comparison to the other guys on the team, guys and gals on the team. He adopts the identity of Goliath and uses the Pym particles to become this giant, this Goliath guy. So then you've got Yellow Jacket and Goliath, which for a couple of years he's Goliath. Then he goes back to the bow and arrow stuff. And then the name Goliath is open again, so that's when Bill Foster becomes Black Goliath. And he's Black Goliath until 1979. Then he becomes Giant Man. Not Black Giant Man, just Giant Man. But then later, he goes back to Black Goliath. And then after that, he goes back to Giant Man. And then finally, he settles on Goliath in 2006, just in time to get killed off. Well, 1979, there's a new Ant-Man, Scott Lang, who was an ex-convict who worked, I think, for Tony Stark, but who adopts the identity. He actually steals the Ant-Man suit because he has to go rescue his daughter. And Henry Pym, who's still Yellow Jacket and hasn't had a breakdown yet, gives him his blessing for him to become Ant-Man. So he's Ant-Man for over 20 years until he gets killed off and is replaced by Eric O'Grady, who is called the Irredeemable Ant-Man because he was actually a bad guy who was trying to go straight but really not that hard. So that's Henry Pym becomes Ant-Man, becomes Giant Man, becomes Goliath, becomes Yellow Jacket, becomes just plain Henry Pym. So Hawkeye becomes Goliath, but goes back to Hawkeye, and Bill Foster becomes Black Goliath, and then he goes to Giant Man, back to Black Goliath, back to Giant Man to Goliath, and now there's a new Ant-Man, but then there's not, because there's another new Ant-Man. Are you confused yet? If not, then be aware, Michael Douglas, who co-stars in the Ant-Man movie as Henry Pym, the guy who invented the Ant-Man suit that the Scott Lang character in the movie sets out to steal, and then they work together. So Kirk Douglas is playing, not Kirk Douglas, his son. I've confused myself. Kirk Douglas beget Michael Douglas, who plays Henry Pym, but not Ant-Man, because Scott Lang is Ant-Man, except in the second movie, Ant-Man and the Wasp, in a flashback, we get to see Michael Douglas as Henry Pym in action as Ant-Man from several decades ago. So, there you go. All that, and so far, not even one alternate parallel reality Earth. All on the same one. So, Lee and Kirby introduced the Fantastic Four in November 1961. Then 2 months later, in January of 1962, they introduced Henry Pym, but as part of kind of a science fiction horror story, not yet as Ant-Man. The first new superhero that they introduced, because he didn't become Ant-Man until September, was in May with the introduction of the Incredible Hulk, which was very different from anything that anyone was doing at the time other than the Fantastic Four with the Thing. Now, all that fan mail that they had started getting, not counting the stuff they wrote themselves, a lot of it focused on how popular the Thing was with audiences, because they felt sorry for him, because he was a poignant character, a nice guy who was trapped in the body of a monster. So let's give him some more of that. So sort of as a combination of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Frankenstein monster, maybe throw a little Quasimodo from the Hunchback of Notre Dame in there for sympathy's sake and poignancy. This hero is a scientist, Bruce Banner, who I think his full name is it David Bruce? Anyway, Bruce Banner, who is working with gamma radiation. So that's one thing to take note of, is how in the early 60s, particularly with Marvel, the superhero origins, how frequently they're related to radiation in some form. Because now, right, it's the atomic age, as opposed to the golden age and that first wave of superheroes in the late 30s and early 40s, when, with a few exceptions like Superman, who was an alien, most of the superheroes who had powers, like Green Lantern or Captain Marvel, had them by means of magic. Well, there's still going to be some magic, but radiation is the big fear of the time, and now it's being turned from a fear into something that could possibly have positive side effects, although Bruce Banner probably, in fact, definitely didn't regard this as positive. So what happened was he had invented a gamma radiation bomb that was going to be tested in the deserts of New Mexico. But the testing site, which was clearly marked "Do Not Enter Dangerous," as they're getting ready to explode the bomb, they see that this dumb teenager, Rick Jones, had broken in so he could go out there and hang out and play his harmonica. And so Dr. Banner runs out there to warn the kid away, not knowing that there's a spy on the science team working for the Soviets, who pushes the fire button early, and the explosion occurs. Dr. Banner had just enough time to shove the teenager into a ditch, but then he takes the full brunt of the gamma radiation explosion, which is obviously going to have some serious repercussions for him. It's going to make him turn into a big, ill-tempered monster. Well, the big ill-tempered monster thing was a little bit different at first. Okay, so later on, in fact, it doesn't take too much later, it becomes established that when Bruce Banner gets angry or upset, when his heart races, then he loses control and hulks out, to use a phrase that later was associated with it, and turns into a big green monster who has kind of rudimentary intelligence and sort of talks like a 4-year-old would talk, and kind of acts like a little kid, throws tantrums sometimes, but in some ways it's kind of sweet, right, until he calms down and reverts back to Bruce Banner. Well, in the beginning, it was at nighttime. When nighttime came, he would turn into a big gray monster that had the intelligence level of Bruce Banner, but was like it was like Jekyll and Hyde, right? He was as the gray monster. The Hulk was just really, really cranky and kind of wicked. And Rick Nelson would try to be on hand to help Banner not to do too much damage, keep him confined during these times. The comic lasted only 6 issues. Didn't take off as well as they had hoped. The sales weren't great. So it got canceled. The Incredible Hulk was canceled with issue 6. But the character was continued over in the pages of Tales to Astonish, which, like Tales of Suspense and other comics, each issue would actually have 2 stories in it, from with two different characters. So the Hulk went over there and shared that book with Henry Pym for a few issues, and then they kicked Henry Pym out, which may have contributed, I guess, to his emotional instability. I don't know, but replaced him with the Submariner. And then the popularity took off, and that book was renamed The Incredible Hulk. Now, Rick Jones, if you only know the Hulk from the screen, whether we're talking about the 1970s TV show or the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, you've never seen Rick Jones because he's never been in any of them. But he was a big component in the early years of the Hulk. And he was clearly modeled on the very popular teenage heartthrob Ricky Nelson, who had just started going by Rick Nelson now that he had turned 21 at around that time. So the trajectory of the Rick Jones character later kind of follows Rick Nelson's trajectory. He's at this time he's kind of like a wannabe rock and roll singer, and then gradually he starts to get gigs, and then later on he becomes a famous rock star and dabbles in movies, and then he becomes a washed-up has-been over the years. Oddly enough, in 1982, in the one-season-long animated show The Incredible Hulk, because Urban Cowboy had come out with John Travolta and been really popular and started kind of a country music craze, riding mechanical bulls and all that stuff, Rick Nelson in that one was a wannabe country singer. I think that may be why it only lasted one season. Now, I have mentioned Rick Jones on here before when we were talking about Captain Marvel, because he kind of becomes a lifelong professional sidekick, as he's the sidekick to the Hulk for a while. Then, in a really weird and probably not real healthy move, Captain America dresses him up like Bucky, and so he's like the fake Bucky for a while. Then he's the sidekick of the Marvel Captain Marvel. Then later still becomes the sidekick of Rom the Space Knight. All right, well, so now we've got the Incredible Hulk. In August of 1962, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby introduced the mighty Thor in the pages of Journey into Mystery. Now, again, if you only know Thor from the screen, you don't know too much about Dr. Donald Blake, his alter ego, or that he even had an alter ego. And kind of a nod to this in the first Marvel Thor movie, when he has to have a fake identity made, it's Donald Blake. So here's what happened. In Journey into Mystery, this doctor, Donald Blake, who's visiting Scandinavia, goes into this cave. Now he has a bad leg and he has to walk with a cane. And deep in this cave he gets lost in, he finds the magical hammer of Thor, Mjolnir, and written on it, "Whosoever shall be worthy, if he can lift this hammer, will be the mighty Thor." And so he picks it up and then immediately gets turned into Thor, the god of thunder. And so thereafter, he goes about his business as physician Dr. Blake, with his nurse Jane Foster. But when danger is near, he taps his cane on the ground, and in a flash of lightning turns into Thor, who for some reason speaks in Elizabethan English. Now, I can think of no reason at all that a Scandinavian thunder god would speak in Shakespearean tones, but that sort of lent a little idea of otherness, I guess. So, what about Asgard and all that stuff? Well, we find out that actually, much later, Donald Blake isn't a real person. That Thor, son of Odin, had a problem with being too arrogant and not following directions and thinking too highly of himself. So to teach him humility, Odin banished him from Asgard, banished him to Midgard, or Earth, in the form of a man who had a physical handicap, so that he would learn humility, and also in the guise of a man who is giving, is a doctor and lives to help others. And so eventually the guise of Donald Blake is abandoned by Thor because he doesn't need it anymore. Now, in the backup stories that appeared in Journey into Mystery and later into The Mighty Thor, which Journey into Mystery gets its name changed to that, there was a backup feature by Lee and Kirby that Kirby was a lot more probably influential in than Stan Lee, called Tales of Asgard. And this was stories of the younger Thor, like 1,000 years ago. And in these stories, we get to know Asgard and all the different characters there: Odin and Heimdall and Sif and Balder and Volstagg and so forth. And these were beautifully rendered with the artwork of Kirby, inked by Vince Colletta, and they were really good stories. And in a lot of cases, they were better than the main story. That same month, August 1962, same month that Thor debuted, so did another new character, Spider Man. Now, this one was not by Lee and Kirby, it was by Lee and Steve Ditko. So there's a lot of different stories about how the character was created. You've got the Stan Lee version. Actually, you have several Stan Lee versions. The Steve Ditko version, and you've got the Jack Kirby version, in which Kirby claimed that it was his original idea. Well, let's just look at some of those stories. According to Stan Lee, his idea for Spider-Man came from the fact that they had noticed that their books, starting with Fantastic Four, were selling really well, not just to the 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds, but to 15, 16, 17-year-olds, a little bit older than normally even read comic books. That's the time when the interest was usually starting to fall off. So, to further capture that market, Lee said, he wanted a lead character, who was a teenager that the teenagers could identify with, rather than a teenager as a sidekick. Hence the name Spider-Man instead of Spider-Boy, which would make him sound inferior somehow. Plus, he wanted the character to age as the book went along. So, a hero with spider-like qualities who is a teenager. According to the story that Lee tells, he then went with this idea to Jack Kirby, who was his major cooperator in producing these things. And Kirby came up with a design. Now, Kirby says that the idea was his and that it was based closely on an idea that Joe Simon and he had come up with back in the 50s for Crestwood Publications, for a character called the Silver Spider that never got used. Anyway, Kirby's version was rejected by Stan Lee because it looked too heroic, and that's not the look he was aiming for. He said, Stan Lee said, it looked like Captain America with cobwebs, and there's something different they were aiming at. Now, Joe Simon has said that, he's taken Stan Lee's side on the story, because he says that the Silver Spider idea is actually what became the Fly from Charlton Comics, and that Kirby's original concept that he presented to Stan Lee looked too much like the Fly. So instead, Stan Lee went with Steve Ditko, who had a very, very different style than Jack Kirby. A much less, quote, heroic and dramatic style. A lot more sinewy, I guess you might say. And so Ditko came back with his concept, his design of the character's costume. So, among other things, he said, okay, this guy's like a spider, so he should be able to cling to walls, so he can't have big, thick boots. And he had his face completely covered so that the teenage readers, no matter who they were, could imagine it was them inside the mask. So, Lee now had this from Ditko, and so he had to get approval. Had to get approval from Martin Goodman to introduce a new feature. So he went to Martin Goodman with the idea, and Martin Goodman said, in essence, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of in my life. A superhero that's like a spider? That's just stupid. No way am I going to risk losing sales by such a ridiculous idea. And Lee kept pushing the idea forward, and the story goes that because Amazing Fantasy was about to be canceled for low sales, Martin Goodman allowed him to put the Spider-Man story in there. So, what is there? There's nothing to lose there. And so they did. And the book was canceled after that. That was the last issue of Amazing Fantasy. And then when the sales returns started coming in a couple of months later, they found that this book had just flown off the shelves compared to how it had previously been doing. It was actually, that month, was one of the top sellers for Marvel, right up there with Fantastic Four. So that was enough to convince Martin Goodman. So March of 1963, he got his Spider-Man got his own title, and it was a hit. It was a huge hit with high school students and college students, even people up into their 20s. Were buying this and enjoying it. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. One reason is the supporting cast, which not many of them were introduced in Amazing Fantasy 15. That saw the introduction of Peter Parker's Aunt May and Uncle Ben. But the supporting cast that the world has come to know started with Amazing Spider-Man #1. And it was almost like, and this continued for many years, 30 years or more, this kind of like an ongoing soap opera with this large ensemble cast. It wasn't just Peter Parker and his occasional interactions. You got to know all of his, all the people within his sphere, and it was almost like a romance comic in some ways. It was also kind of a lot like, it was a lot similar to those teen humor magazines like Archie, except there wasn't as much humor, although there was some, because Peter Parker was a smart alecky wisecracker. So you've got this hero who is, when it starts, in high school, right? He has the sick aunt that he's living with. And then you get to know the people that he works with in his part-time job as a photographer for the newspaper, the Daily Bugle, and you get to know his friends and enemies in high school and later in college, and then later on in graduate school. So it's a wide range of different characters. Now, another thing that immediately made things stand out, and again, you have to give Steve Ditko as much credit as Stan Lee for this, because he was drawing the stories and setting up the situations that Lee would then provide dialogue and personality essentially for. But the fact that not only was he a teenager who could be you, the hero who could be you, that's one of the taglines. Not only was he a teenager, but also he had problems. And most of the problems he had were the kind of problems teenagers tended to have, right? So his aunt is sick, and he has to pay for the doctor bills, has to work extra, pay for the doctor bills. He goes to work, and he has a really, really mean boss, J. Jonah Jameson, who has a very attractive secretary, Betty Brant, that he gets a crush on, but he's also still got a crush on Liz Allen, the girl that he knows from high school. Then when he gets to college, he meets Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson, and he becomes, all this circle of friends, each with a very distinctive and unique personality, who grow even over time. So that jumped out. That was something, all this combination. There were comics that maybe had one element of this, and other comics that maybe had one element, but nothing had pulled them all together in this way to make it seem, even though it's fantasy, amazing fantasy, but to also kind of make it seem like kind of like real life and believable and the sort of thing that could draw you in. Now, another aspect of it is the fact, and this is touched on from the very beginning, although it's touched on a lot more later, that this teenager who has all these problems, when he becomes Spider-Man, has an avenue of escape and is in a situation where he is in control, right? Where he can be the hero. And that's exactly the sort of adolescent male power fantasy that fueled the rise of superhero comics to begin with. So, of course, this is going to resonate. Now, it's worth mentioning here again the character of Joe Robertson, known as Robbie, who is Jonah Jameson's city editor and second in command, and we get to know him and his family. And he is a kind of a father figure. Uncle Ben was a father figure to begin with, but he only lasted a few pages, right? So Robbie becomes the wise mentor for Peter Parker, and thus for the readers, and is also kind of the heart and soul of the Daily Bugle and the conscience, the one thing that can rein the antics of J. Jonah Jameson in. So, not surprisingly, when you look at all those things, Spider-Man became the most popular thing that Marvel had done yet. The month after Spider-Man and Thor debuted, Henry Pym came back this time as a superhero. So, by the end of 1962, 1 year after the Marvel superhero floodgates had started to open, Marvel now had the Fantastic Four, Ant-Man, the Hulk, who, remember, was gray in his first issue but became green with issue 2. Turns out because green is a lot easier for the colorist to work with. And the Mighty Thor and the Amazing Spider-Man, all co-created by Stan Lee, all but one co-created with Stan Lee by Jack Kirby, the exception being Spider-Man, co-created by Steve Ditko. So that's where we are in January of 63, that in March of that year, Spider-Man gets his own title. Well, what's going to happen next?